Good morning, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Make Saints podcast. I'm Drew Downs. And this one, it's about killing. It's about killing. We might think of it as killing in the name of. Yeah. So there is this thing this past week that happened that got me thinking about an old TV show, but 25-year-old TV show, and maybe it did for you as well. This was the season 1 finale of The West Wing, and President Bartlet was giving a speech, and after the speech, he's walking the rope line, and shots ring out. There are a couple of gunmen and trying to shoot at the president, and we don't know what happens. And in the season premiere of season 2, we find out that they weren't just targeting the president; they were actually targeting Charlie, his person, right? His number one guy who's there around him. As racial motivation, sort of a rise of the what we would now paint as the alt-right. Now, one of the reasons it came to mind, of course, was not just because of the assassination attempt, but because of what you discover. Because when you love the show like I did, and you bought the DVDs and you watched the commentaries, and they talked about in the commentary for that episode that they had to write excuses into the season 2 premiere because that's not how it would work. Because the Secret Service wouldn't let the president walk a rope line with so many vantage points. That just wouldn't be what they would allow. So they had to sort of create in this. They had to speculate how a president could so go against the Secret Service's direction. And sort of it brings to mind the question of whose authority, right? And it really does sort of create a system of authority that becomes we're probably even more conscious of in 2024 than we were in 1999 or 2000, right? At the time. And so we're left with this sort of interesting note, because this is something that has come up. People have been asking about and speculating about Secret Service and their role and how this works, and whether or not they would have allowed the former president to raise his fist, and expose his head, and those sorts of things, why that would be allowed in that situation, or tolerated, or how he could get away with it, all of that. And so it sort of creates all sort of speculation, and conspiracy theory has come up around that. So that brought it to mind. It wasn't just the nature of the assassination attempt. It is the sort of sense of the Secret Service, the place, the speculating, and why it would happen this way. I want to talk. I'm not talking about the TV show, and I'm not really interested in the whys. Ultimately, I'm interested in why it is that we need that why. What it is that we're actually looking for, and what we're trying to do in this with one another. And I think one of those the interesting pieces, and again, it's why that show came to mind, was it exposes the question is not about partisanship, right? It's a political act to try and kill someone. Every attempt to kill another human being is a political act, but it doesn't make it a partisan act. These people weren't targeting a president because of a political party. They were targeting his body man because he was black. That's not a partisan political framework. It doesn't fit into Democrat, Republican. It doesn't fit into left, right, inherently. It doesn't fit into those schemas that we use to simplify our world. It fits outside of that schema. It fits in a much bigger, more robust vision of the world, in which people have different political ideologies than oppositional binary black and white. It exposes how much our desire to make it easy erases half of the data from the conversation and leaves us vulnerable to misinformation and vulnerable to accepting things we ought not accept. Now, in the midst of this, I also want to talk about the sort of scope, and one of those is that it gives us a great way into that is to think about that old sort of proverb about 4 different people being asked to talk about and describe an elephant. 4 different blind people being asked to say what is an elephant, and each one is touching a different part of the tail, the leg, the trunk, the ear, right? And each one is describing the elephant, and each description is completely different, right? I love this example not only because it's a traditional one, but because it's so illustrative and in ways that continue to bring new ideas to mind. Like, we continue to make this mistake because what we have now in all of these different speculations and these different arguments and social media is great at atomizing us and encouraging us to pick fights about in particularities. And so what you have is someone describing an elephant by describing its trunk. So they're not describing the whole elephant, they're just describing the trunk, and they're claiming it's the whole elephant. Well, then you have someone jumping in and saying, that's not an elephant, right? And rather than being like, dude, it's bigger. There's a bigger picture here. You're only describing the trunk. There's a bigger picture here. But instead of like inviting us into ways that have that bigger picture, we end up having fights about the trunk. And the irony of all of this is we're fighting over the trunk and claiming we're fighting over the elephant. And so this ends up being how we end up having these fights, these internet fights, these real life arguments with people we love, is that we're talking about a piece of the whole as if it's the whole, and then we all just talk about it. So, gun violence, the conversations about gun violence focus only on one part of the elephant. It only ever talks about that one part of the elephant. And that part of the elephant is not guns, right? One of the beauties of derailing conversations about reducing gun violence is by shifting the view. And so you just keep moving from the different parts of the elephant. And we have these different arguments about the different parts of the elephant. And whenever we're talking about one particular part of the elephant, they can always say, but you're not talking about this other part. But it's a way of avoiding talking about the whole, actually dealing with the whole. It's a way to keep the conversations atomized and refuse to talk about the whole. Now, one of the other things that we do about this too is there is a tendency when you can see the big picture to sort of step outside of the picture. And so, one of the mistakes that we often do when we do this is we continue to keep that false binary vision in place. It's not a vision of, an elephant having a bunch of different parts. It's actually envisioning the world as left and right, and that's it. And sometimes we like to step outside of that and pretend we're above a left-right split. Everyone else, the entire world gets to be a left-right split. But we get to stand above it, like as if we're little gods. We can look at the whole thing and be like, man, you guys are stupid arguing about those two things. Why don't you just do both, right? Or like, like with this whole both sides, you guys got to just stop fighting. Just stop fighting, like as if that helps us stop the fighting, right? As a way of a sort of standing above it all. This is the terrain we're talking about. We're talking about confusion. We're talking about mistaking, a whole for singular parts, not even the sum of its parts. We're talking about a false binary choice. We're talking about different experiences of life, different experiences of politics and relationships and all of these things. And it's a whole big old cocktail of misinformation and confusion and fear and worry about how things are going. All of that is happening right now, and we don't know what to do with it. We don't know what to do with it. So I do want to invite us to think about it in one last way, which is to remember that in all things, then killing is wrong. Killing is not an opportunity for someone else. But killing is itself a wrong behavior. It's always wrong. There's no lesser of two evils. There's still only evil. And there is a temptation then to take that sort of killing is always wrong mindset and try to then paint this as something to ignore, avoid. So we don't reflect on an attempted assassination. We don't reflect on the fact that not only was an assassination attempted, but it was completed, not because the target was killed, but someone else was. That no God wished that person dead. That it doesn't matter. There's the element of which it doesn't matter who starts a thing when all the people end up dead. There's a lot of people at fault. It becomes a common problem. There's a way in which we might also isolate this individual who was himself shot and killed, to isolate him as the only one. It's not just the lone gunman theory of other political assassinations that leads to speculation and dismissal. The idea of a lone gunman is part of the deal. There was this was a plan, of course, if you look into the white power movement back in their development in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and in the literature that was built around it. One of the things that they designed as part of their political will is to create the lone wolf theory. And they themselves created it and offered it to the world. So they did this and then gave the language to the journalists who were covering it to then use in their coverage to say that all of these people who were spreading white power propaganda, which is itself adjacent and overlapping with the white supremacy movement and different other kinds of groups, Christian identity movement, and but the sort of overarching constellation is often referred to as the white power movement. The white power movement came up with this idea, which was they watched other groups get RICO'd into oblivion and getting pulled into prison and being charged with murders of other people because they were part of an ongoing movement. So what they did was they attempted to decentralize the movement, give everyone the literature, spread out the designs, network with one another, but not have any kind of control. So what you would do is you run around offering terrible, hateful rhetoric to the world, hoping to convince as many people as possible to accept it, knowing that some of the people who do accept it are crazy and will go and kill people for it. And by doing it this way, they could avoid being prosecuted for getting other people to kill people. And they created this language. They created the name for it, the lone wolf, and they offered it to the media, and the media took it. And similarly, the courts have accepted it, all just as they hoped they would. So now we have this lone wolf that we can all just say, oh man, that crazy person, right? So even if you don't buy into conspiracy theories, you don't have to buy into any of these other pieces. You don't have to worry or speculate, and you can be a high-minded person. And the most high-minded people are the ones who are most likely to accept this understanding of the lone wolf. And they'll take that and they'll say, what can we do? What can we do is just one guy. One guy. At a time when our country lavishes one another with guns, that encourages incredible acts of violence and hatred, which invite everyone around them to be fearful of the other people around them, that invite derision and hatred, that invite the people next to us to be seen as the enemy and worthy of our disdain, our fear, and ultimately, therefore, our need to protect ourselves from them. And when we've continued to shove that rhetoric into each other's faces, well then, we can then give a scapegoat, make a scapegoat of a young man who did a heinous thing, and go, man, that one guy, he was crazy. We can choose to do things differently. We can choose to see each other differently. We can choose a different way. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.